Our next question tonight is on the NHS. It's an area where powers are devolved to the Scottish Parliament and to the assemblies in Wales and Northern Ireland. This debate is about the election of the Parliament at Westminster, where MPs legislate on health matters in England. And our question comes from Terry Kelly.
As a 63-year-old, I've grown up with the NHS and have recently retired after 30 years of working there. So you can understand I'm strongly passionate about it. My question is this. How will your party ensure long-term funding for the NHS whilst keeping it as a public service accessible to all?
Thank you very much indeed, Terry. And I'll turn first to Nigel Farage.
Well, Terry, like you, I care about the NHS because I've had so many scrapes in my life. I've needed it far more than most people. And I think that when it comes to emergency care, it probably is the best in the world. That doesn't mean there aren't some things that occasionally go wrong. This whole question of how we fund the health service with a population that's rapidly rising, with a population that is ageing, is a huge question. We've had a big internal debate in our party about it, and we've decided the best way to do it is to run it efficiently, to run it as a public service, free at the point of access, but to recognise that there has been a 48% growth in middle management of the NHS since 1997. The Labour Party attempted to privatise large chunks of the health service. That I also don't believe has worked. I'd put an extra £3 billion in from savings to our EU contributions, and I'd stop the tax on illness by ending hospital parking charges.
Nigel Farage, thank you. Nicola Sturgeon.
In Scotland, we've already ended hospital parking charges. Terry, this is a really important question. The NHS is the most precious public service we've got. I was Scottish Health Secretary for 5 years. In Scotland, we've protected the budget of the NHS and we will always do so. We also believe passionately that the NHS should always be run as a public service, not for private profit. That's why we oppose the privatisation that is happening in England. We oppose it in principle, but also because it poses a risk in the long term to Scotland's budget. And that's why SNP MPs in the House of Commons will take the opportunity to vote against any extension to privatisation in England, and it's one of the many ways in which we'll seek to build progressive alliances to protect things that matter to all of us. But the best thing we can do for the NHS is to end austerity. You'll hear the other parties tonight talk about increasing funding, but if they try to do that within the framework of overall spending cuts, then they'll have to cut even deeper elsewhere. And anybody that tells you that cutting the social care budget or the welfare budget is good for the NHS is wrong. Let's lift austerity, invest in the NHS, but without making deeper cuts elsewhere.
Nicola Sturgeon, thank you. Natalie Bennett.
Well, Terry, I think it's really worth noting how the NHS wasn't a huge issue in the 2010 election, but it's a huge issue now. In 2010, we were well aware of the huge costs of the private finance initiative and how there was already a creeping privatisation of the NHS. But what we've seen since then, particularly with the Health and Social Care Act, has been a race towards setting up the structures for privatisation. Now, what we say in the Green Party is very simple. The profit motive should have no place in healthcare. We're not happy with 5% of money that's supposed to be for healthcare going in profits. We want 0% going in profits. And to make our NHS more efficient, to deal with some of its problems, what we need to do is take the whole market mechanism out of the NHS, the whole purchaser-provider split that the Health Select Committee in 2010 said was costing us £10 billion a year. We need to put more money in, and in the Green Party we want the free prescriptions they've got in Scotland, plus free eye care and free dental. But we need to look at the structures and say no private profit.
Natalie Bennett, thank you very much indeed. Nick Clegg.
Well, look, we've heard lots of warm words here about the NHS. Of course, we all love the NHS, but the NHS doesn't need warm words, it needs hard cash. And I'll give you the precise number of how much extra cash it needs. It needs £8 billion by the end of the next Parliament. That is what a man called Simon Stevens, who runs NHS England, he's independent of politics, has said it needs. Now, the Liberal Democrats have a plan about how to find that £8 billion. Unlike the Conservatives, we'll ask the richest to pay a little extra in tax for the NHS, closing the reliefs, for instance, in capital gains tax. Unlike Labour, we'll also be able to put money in the NHS because we'll actually get the job done of balancing the books, and then we can invest in the NHS. That is the way to balance the books and invest in the NHS. It means £8 billion more here, £800 million more for the NHS in Scotland and £450 million more in Wales. And my challenge to the leaders here is, if you love the NHS so much, why don't you put your money where your heart is?
Nick Clegg, thank you. Leanne Wood.
Plaid Cymru is proud that Wales gave the world the NHS. It's probably one of the most important contributions of our modern age. And it was based on a scheme founded by people contributing together to fund the health that they needed collectively. The NHS is precious and it must be defended against privatisation. And the NHS in Wales faces two threats. One, from continued austerity and cuts, but two, from centralisation under Labour in Wales. Plaid Cymru wants to recruit and attract an additional 1,000 doctors into the Welsh NHS to bring us up to the same level as the rest of the UK. At the moment, we're way behind. We have fewer doctors per head of the population than the vast majority of countries in the EU. The NHS needs to be funded through general taxation.
Leanne Wood, thank you. Ed Miliband.
Terry, like so many people around the country, I'm deeply concerned about what I see happening in our National Health Service, because we see people waiting longer for their test results, longer in A&E, longer to see a GP, longer to have an operation. We've got to turn it round. And when you hear from us leaders tonight, I think at home you should ask, where specifically is the money coming from? I'll tell you. We're going to have a mansion tax on the most expensive homes above £2 million. That's a clear promise from us. We're going to get money from those hedge funds who are engaging in tax avoidance, and we're going to get money from the tobacco companies for a £2.5 billion time to care fund. That will hire 20,000 more nurses, 8,000 more doctors, 5,000 more care workers, and 3,000 more midwives. And it's not just more staff, because it's also joining up services from home to hospital, taking on the biggest challenge our NHS faces, which is an ageing population. Because if people can't get in to see their GP or can't be looked after at home, they end up in A&E. It's a plan to turn the NHS round.
Ed Miliband, thank you. David Cameron.
Well, first of all, thank you, Terry, for your incredible service to the NHS. And you're absolutely right. This is the most important national institution and national public service that we have. And I'll never forget, as a dad of a desperately disabled child, what I got every night when I took him to hospital, worrying about his health. I got unbelievable care, and I just want that for every family and for everyone in our country. Now, we've been talking about the difficult decisions we had to make to turn the economy around, but a difficult decision we made also was to go on funding the NHS, putting more money in every year, and we go on doing that in the next Parliament. That meant that we've trained 7,000 more nurses, we've got 9,000 more doctors, and we also managed to take out of the NHS 20,000 bureaucrats, because I want the money spent on patient care. Now, it's key that we keep a strong economy in order to fund a strong NHS. And I want to see the NHS move to much more 7-day operation, like your GP being open 8 in the morning, 8 in the evening, all the way through the week. There's one point I want to end on. There's only one group of politicians anywhere in this United Kingdom who've cut the NHS in the last 5 years, and that was the Labour Party in Wales. So when you hear Ed Miliband's promises, think about that.
Thank you very much indeed, party leaders, for your opening comments on that question. I'm going to turn to Nigel Farage to open the debate.
Yeah, I just wonder what everybody thinks about health tourism. Leanne made the point that it was christened the National Health Service, but as we now have a lot of people coming into Britain and using the National Health Service who are not British residents, that is estimated to cost about £2 billion a year. I just wonder, would the panel agree with me that actually it needs to be the National Health Service? And wouldn't it be a sensible thing if, like every other sensible country in the world, we said to foreign workers who come to Britain, you must have health insurance when you come here?
Let me bring in Natalie Bennett. You were shaking your head there.
Absolutely not. The figures on health tourism and indeed benefit tourism that Nigel Farage is often citing, they do not reflect the reality. The situation is that people come here as immigrants to work, or they come here to seek asylum as refugees. And we've had a really dangerous, damaging debate about immigration, fuelled, where it's been fuelled from, but sadly followed by the others. We need to look at the fact that our NHS is hugely dependent on foreign-born workers. It couldn't operate without them.
Thank you very much indeed, Natalie Bennett. Let's just remind ourselves of the question, how will your party secure the long-term funding of the NHS while keeping it a public service available to all? Ed Miliband.
Nigel, of course we have to look at those issues and deal with those issues, but I really don't believe that that is at the root of all of the problems of the National Health Service. And I want to pick up on something David Cameron said, because he said he protected the NHS. I ask you at home to decide whether this is what protection looks like. 1 million people waited last year in A&E for more than 4 hours. We've got ambulances queuing outside our accident and emergency units. We're missing the targets for cancer treatment for the first time ever. And to add to that, we had a tent erected in a hospital car park to treat people in 2015 in our United Kingdom. I do not believe that is protecting the NHS, and his spending plans for the next Parliament are even more dangerous for our National Health Service.
David Cameron.
Well, first of all, let's just take the one example of cancer. What we're seeing with cancer under this government is 460,000 more people a year getting seen and getting examined for cancer than used to happen. Our survival rates for cancer that used to be some of the worst in Europe are now actually some of the best in Europe. We are changing the NHS and we're improving it. But a strong NHS needs a strong economy. If we go back to Labour's plans for taxes and debt and spending and welfare, the economy will be wrecked, and that will wreck the NHS. And this point about the commitments we made is important, because when I said we'd fund the NHS more every year, the Labour view was that was irresponsible. The Liberal Democrat view was that wasn't the right approach. And Labour cut the NHS in Wales where the outcomes are worse.
David,
so we
let's talk
care
about
your words
David Cameron,
on the
thank you, Ed
NHS.
Miliband. Just for a moment, thank you. Nick Clegg.
Terry asks how are we going to safeguard the NHS for future generations? And in view, as Terry and we all know, of an ageing population. The NHS is under greater pressure than ever before. But there's a simple question. Who has got the plan to put £8 billion of additional money into the NHS? That is what all of us standing here have been told it requires. You're not going to get it in Scotland. The SNP have actually reduced the amount of money compared to what we've done in south of the border. And you're only going to get it if you're going to ask the wealthiest to pay a small additional contribution. One other thing I'd like to say, mental health has for far too long been the poor cousin of physical health in the NHS. The more we can do to treat mental health in the same way that we've long treated physical health, I think that'll put the NHS in good shape for the future.
Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, the NHS budget in Scotland has increased by £3 billion since the SNP took office. It will go up by £400 million next year. You know, look, I think, well, one of the things we've learned is that there's not anything that Nigel Farage won't blame on foreigners. Actually, the pressures on our health service, many of them are things that we should celebrate. People are living longer. We've got new treatments, new technologies. How do we deal with that to protect it for future generations? First, we've got to reform. As of yesterday in Scotland, health and social care services are integrated. And yes, we've got to invest. I think it's right to accept the Stevens report, but Nick Clegg's £8 billion figure is an England-only figure. That would be £9.5 billion for the whole UK. And if you follow the plan I'm putting forward of modest, fiscally responsible spending increases, we can invest more in the health service, but we can do that without cutting welfare and social security.
Thank you, Nicola Sturgeon. Leanne Wood.
Health has been used as a political football by Labour and the Conservatives in order to try to score points off each other ahead of the general election. And the people that suffer most when that happens are the patients and the staff in the Welsh NHS. Now, there are problems in health in England and in Wales, and my view is that those problems are exacerbated by cuts to social services, but they're also exacerbated by privatisation. And it was the Labour Party that began the process of privatisation in the health service. They introduced PFI schemes and they introduced foundation hospitals as well. And my view is that the private sector has no role in a public health service.
Ed Miliband.
I'll just say on this, Leanne, my two sons were born in a PFI hospital. It was an old falling down hospital. But you're right, there need to be limits to privatisation. That's why we said we'll roll back the tide of privatisation that is starting under David Cameron and is about to go much, much further. We'll cap the profits of the private sector. But I do want to come back to David Cameron.
Because
he said he's protected the NHS and he said he kept his word. David, you made a whole series of promises at the last general election to people. You said no top-down reorganisation. You didn't listen to the staff, and that's exactly what happened. You said no going back to the days when people had to wait hours on end in A&E. That's exactly what happened. I don't think people will take seriously your promises on the NHS because you broke all the promises you made at the last general election.
Let me tell Ed Miliband what we did. We took 20,000 bureaucrats out of the NHS and put 9,000 doctors and 7,000 nurses in. Now, he opposes those reforms. Presumably, he'd like to rehire the bureaucrats. I want doctors with stethoscopes, not bureaucrats with clipboards. But let me answer Terry very directly about the things we can really do to make a difference with our NHS. Dementia is a silent crisis in our country where We're raising the diagnosis rates. We need to keep going with that. This point about a 7-day operation is really important. Just a few miles down the road from where we are tonight is the Salford Royal Hospital. They carry out operations and scans and treatments on Saturday and Sunday as much as they do Monday to Friday. And as a result, they provide a fantastic service. So we can improve our NHS if we improve the way it works and go after the things like dementia, like public health, like some of the big public health challenges that put so much pressure onto our NHS.
Natalie Bennett.
David Cameron, since you're talking numbers, let's look at the £6 billion that last year went to the private health firms. Now, Leanne is absolutely right. This privatisation is causing huge damage. And what we're doing is actually racing towards the American healthcare system, a system that uses twice the percentage of GDP that we use on healthcare for actual worse outcomes. And just one more point that I really want to pick up is we also need to think about the nature of our society. And if we're going to take pressure off the NHS, we need a healthier society, deal with air pollution, encourage walking and cycling.
Thank you.
Take the stress off people.
Natalie Bennett. Nick Clegg. On the markets in the NHS.
Well, look, it is just simply not the case. It's just simply not true that there's been some great push towards privatisation. It is simply not the case. Well, you could assert otherwise. No.
What?
Actually, I'll tell. Well, let me give you a statistic.
You legislated to allow 49% of hospital beds to be in the private
actually
sector.
legislated to outlaw.
Thank you, Nicola Sturgeon.
Legislated to outlaw the sweetheart deals which were entered into with the private sector by the Labour government, as it happens.
I'm not defending them.
When we took over 5 years ago, the total amount of NHS money devoted to the private sector was 4%. It is now 6%. I don't call that a great sweeping act of privatisation. But all I would say is it needs the money, 8 billion. We need to prioritise mental health and we need to bring social care and health care together because we have too many elderly folk in hospital beds who should be discharged from hospital but don't have a place to go.
Thank you. Nigel Farage.
My challenge to everybody here was, of course, ignored and brushed aside for chiefly politically correct reasons. Terry wants to know where the money's coming from. And yes, you've got to put money in, but you've got to stop money being wasted. I mentioned health tourism. OK, here's a fact. And I'm sure the other people will be mortified that I dare to talk about it. There are 7,000 diagnoses in this country every year for people who are HIV positive, which is not a good place for any of them to be, I know. But 60% of them are not British nationals. You can come into Britain from anywhere in the world and get diagnosed with HIV and get the retroviral drugs that cost up to £25,000 per year per patient. I know there are some horrible things happening in many parts of the world, but what we need to do is to put the National Health Service there for British people and families who in many cases have paid into this system for decades.
Thank you. Leanne Wood.
This kind of scaremongering
It's a fact.
rhetoric is dangerous.
It's a fact.
It's dangerous, it divides
Well, it's
communities and it creates stigma to people who are ill. And I think you ought to be ashamed of yourself.
Well, I'm sorry, we've got to put our own people first. I mean, would you, Leanne, open it up to 17,000
Nigel.
people, 27,000 people? The question is, how do we fund the NHS? And if up to £2 billion a year is being lost on health tourism, surely that is a very real problem.
You know,
Nicola Sturgeon.
when somebody is diagnosed with a dreadful illness, my instinct is to view them as a human being, not consider what country they come from.
Exactly.
But I want to go back to something Ed Miliband said earlier on. He said there should be limits on the privatisation of the National Health Service. I'm sorry, Ed, I take a very different view. There should be no privatisation of the health service. Our National Health Service is far too precious to give it up for private profit. And to Nick Clegg, you legislated to allow 49% of hospital beds to be used by the private sector.
Okay,
so my message to people in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, if there are SNP MPs in the House of Commons after the election and you want to roll back the tide of privatisation, we will be your ally in doing that.
Thank you. Briefly to Nick Clegg and then to Ed Miliband.
Well, as I say, 5 years ago, we inherited a situation where the previous Labour government had wasted £250 million, you can't deny this, Ed Miliband, on sweetheart deals with private sector contractors in the NHS, which didn't help a single NHS patient. We outlawed that use of public money for private sector for contracts which were only based on price rather than quality. And as I said earlier, 4% under Labour was already devoted to the private sector. It's only 6% now. It is simply not the case to allege that privatisation has happened in an unbridled fashion since this government came into power.
You supported the Health and Social Care Act, which is a recipe for privatisation in our NHS. But there's a bigger issue for people at home. and that's future plans for the NHS. I've set out where the money's coming from. David Cameron is planning to double the spending cuts next year and bigger cuts in the next 3 years. Think what that would mean, not just for the NHS, but social care. If you cut social care dramatically, as has happened in this Parliament, you undermine the NHS fundamentally, because elderly people don't get the help in their own home, they end up in hospital, and the NHS is creaking at the seams. That is what is happening now. Imagine what it would be like with another 5 years of David Cameron.
David Cameron.
Ed Miliband is scaremongering, and he said in an interview that he wanted to weaponise the NHS. Now, for most of us, the NHS is a service for our families, not a political weapon. And I think, let's be clear about social care. We are it started on the 1st of April, a new fund, the Better Care Fund, with £5.3 billion in, bringing health and social care together so we can unblock those hospital beds, make sure that people get the care they need in the community. But Nick was talking about the inheritance we had. There was something else we inherited in the NHS, which was a culture too often from Labour of cover-up. Just 60 miles from where we are is the Mid Staffords Hospital, and we all remember what we uncovered with that public inquiry, that elderly people were being left uncared for, some of them drinking out of water vases because they weren't being looked after because the target culture had run rampant. We've changed that, and we've made sure there are more nurses on wards, more doctors in charge, and standards of care are going up in our NHS.
But don't you think cuts to social services make that situation even worse, put even more people at risk, because you've got fewer social workers
it's very important.
inspecting homes?
Leanne, I agree. It's very important we fund social care
Clegg.
properly, which we're doing with the social care fund.
I would suggest from this discussion we need 3 things to safeguard the NHS, which was Terry's original question. First, money, the £8 billion. My party has a plan to do so. Secondly, give mental health the same importance and emphasis in the NHS as traditionally given to physical health. And thirdly, make sure that where people, particularly elderly patients, are discharged from hospital, the social care system has a place for them to go. If we do those 3 things, we will protect the NHS for the future.
Let's pick up on the point that David Cameron made about cover-up. Ed Miliband.
Well, look, I would say to everybody at home that use your vote at this election as a weapon to fight for the future of our National Health Service, because it needs to be rescued from you, David.
What about mid-staffs?
Because I've got to say, over 13 years, the Labour government transformed an NHS from 18-month waiting to 18-week waiting. That's our record, and now it's going backwards under you. You've failed the British people. You've broken your bond of trust on the National Health Service. They believed you. They believed you. They believe you're another kind of Conservative, and it's gone backwards on your watch, and they won't trust you again.
Ed Miliband is simply wrong on the figures. There are more nurses, more doctors, more people being treated, and that's because we have a strong economy. He talks about failure. Let's remember the failure of the last Labour government that virtually bankrupted this country and left us with impossibly difficult decisions. But the biggest decision we made was to protect the NHS and to spend more every year, a decision that Labour at the time said was irresponsible. That's what they said. We ignored that, and we went ahead and invested in our NHS as part of a balanced plan for our country.
Ed Miliband.
Well, look, people at home will have to decide. I think the NHS is a foundation for working families in our country. That's why my plan says it's only when working people succeed that Britain succeeds. David Cameron wants to tell you it's all got a lot better. He wants to congratulate himself, pat himself on the back, say he's done a great job. You've got to decide about what your experience is and what you see in the NHS.
Ed Miliband,
I think people will conclude the NHS is going backwards and is not safe in his hands.
Thank you, Natalie Bennett.
I think David Cameron raised the issue of social care, and this is a really critically important one that has huge impacts on the NHS but is important in its own right. Help the Age says there's 2 million people aged over 65 who need social care. 800,000 of them are not getting any help at all. And it's worth thinking for a second about what social care actually is. You might need help getting out of bed and bathing in the morning. You might need help eating. You might need help just living your life. And you're not getting that help you need. And that's why the Green Party is calling for free social care for the over 65s to be provided to everybody who needs it.
Thank you, Natalie Bennett. David Cameron.
There's the point about the £5.3 billion fund that will help fund this vital social care that Natalie's talking about. But I also want to say how important I think it is that we have a 7-day NHS with your GP being open 8 in the morning, 8 in the evening, 7 days a week, because the areas of the country where that's already happening, some of them here in Greater Manchester, we're seeing a lot less pressure on hospitals because people can get to see their GPs when they want. Now, all of this has taken the extra resources that we put into the NHS because the long-term economic plan is working.
David, you promised 7-day waiting in your last manifesto and you failed to deliver it.
Thank you very much indeed, party leaders. We've come to the end of the debate on the issue of the NHS. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for that. We're going to take a short break now. When we come back, the issue will be immigration, so please do stay with us for that.